Chapter 7 of Tales of the Five Towns. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Clifton. Tales of the Five Towns by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 7. Tiddy Follol. It was the dinner hour, and a group of ragged and clay-soiled apprentice boys were making a great noise in the yard of Henry Miners & Co.'s small, compact earthenware manufactory up at Toft End. Toft End caps the ridge to the east of Bursley, and Bursley, which has been the home of the potter for 10 centuries, is the most ancient of the Five Towns in Staffordshire. The boys, dressed for the most part in shirt, trousers and boots, all equally ragged and insecure, were playing at prison bars. Soon the game ended abruptly in a clamorous dispute upon a point of law, and it was not recommenced. The dispute dying a natural death, the tireless energies of the boys needed a fresh outlet. Inspired by a common instinct, they began at once to bait one of their number, a slight youngster of 12 years, much better clothed than the rest, who had adventurously strolled in from a neighbouring manufactory. This child answered their gibes in an amiable, silly, drawling tone, which seemed to justify the epithet loony frequently applied to him. Now and then he stammered, and then companions laughed loud, and he with them. It was known that several years ago he had fallen down a flight of stone steps, alighting on the back of his head, and that ever since he had been deaf of one ear and under some trifling mental derangement. His sublime calmness under their jests baffled them, until the terrible figure of Mr. Machin, the engine man, standing at the door of the slip house, caught their attention and suggested a plan full of joyous possibilities. They gathered round the lad and, talking in subdued murmurs, unanimously urged him with many persuasions to a certain course of action. He declined the scheme, and declined again. Suddenly a boy shouted, "Thee dars na." "I dare," was the drawled, smiling answer. "I tell thee dars na." "I tell thee I dare." And thereupon he slowly but resolutely set out for the slip house door and Mr. Machin. Eli Machin was, beyond doubt, the most considerable employee on Clark's Bank manufactory. Even Henry Clark approached him with a subtly indicated deference, and whenever Silas Emery, the immensely rich and miserly sleeping partner in the firm, came up to visit the works, these two men chatted as old friends. In a modern earthenware manufactory, the engine room is the source of all activity, for, owing to the inventive genius of a famous and venerable son of the Five Towns, steam now presides at nearly every stage in the long process of turning earth into ware. It moves the pug mill, the jollies and the marvellous batting machines, dries the unfired clay, heats the printers' stoves, and warms the offices where the jacket men dwell. Coal is a tremendous item in the cost of production, and a competent, economical engine man can be sure of good wages and a choice of berths. He is desired like a good domestic servant. Eli Machin was the prince of engine men. His engine never went wrong, his coal bills were never extravagant, and, supreme virtue, he was never absent on Mondays. From his post in the slip house he watched over the whole works like a father, stern, gruff, forbidding, but to be trusted absolutely. He was 60 years old and had been putting by for nearly half a century. He lived in a tiny villa cottage with his bedridden, cheerful wife, and lent small sums on mortgage of approved freeholds at 5%, no more and no less. Secure behind this rampart of saved money, he was the equal of the king on the throne. Not a magnate in all the Five Towns who would dare to be condescending to Eli Machin. He had been a sidesman at the old church. A trades union had once asked him to become a working man candidate for the Bursley Town Council, but he had refused because he did not care for the possibility of losing caste by being concerned in a strike. His personal respectability was entirely unsullied, and he worshipped this abstract quality as he worshipped God. There was only one blot, but how foul, on Eli Machin's career, and that had been dropped by his daughter Miriam, when, defying his authority, she married a scene shifter at Hanbridge Theatre. The atrocious idea of being connected with the theatre had rendered him speechless for a time. He could but endure it in the most awful silence that ever hid passionate feeling. Then, one day, he had burst out, "The wench is no better than a tiddy fol lol." Only this solitary phrase, nothing else. What a tiddy fol lol was, no one quite knew, but the word getting about stuck to him, and for some weeks boys used to shout it after him in the streets, until he caught one of them and in 30 seconds put an end to the practice. Thenceforth Miriam, with all hers, was dead to him. When her husband expired of consumption, Eli Machin saw the avenging arm of the Lord in action. And when her boy grew to be a source of painful anxiety to her, he said to himself that the wrath of heaven was not yet cooled towards this impious daughter. The passage of 15 years had apparently in no way softened his resentment. The challenged lad in Miner's Yard slowly approached the slip-house door and halted before Eli Machin, grinning. "Well, young 'un," the old man said absently, "what dost want?" "Tiddy fol lol, grandfeyther," the child drawled in his silly, irritating voice, and added, "They said I darena say it to ye." Without an instant's hesitation, Eli Machin raised his still powerful arm and, catching the boy under the ear, knocked him down. The other boys yelled with unaffected pleasure and ran away. "Get up and be off with ye. Ye dunna belong to this bank," said Eli Machin in cold anger to the lad. But the lad did not stir. The lad's eyes were closed, and he lay white on the stones. Eli Machin bent down and peered through his spectacles at the prone form upon which the midday sun was beating. "It's Miriam's boy," he ejaculated under his breath, and looked round as if in inquiry. The yard was empty. Then, with quick decision, he picked up this limp and inconvenient parcel of humanity and ran with it out of the yard into the road. Down the road he ran, turned to the left into Clowes Street, and stopped before a row of small brown cottages. At the open door of one of these cottages a woman sat sewing. She was rather stout and full-bosomed, with a fair, fresh face, full of sense and peace. She looked under 30, but was older. "Here's thy Tommy, Miriam," said Eli Machin shortly. "He give me some of his sauce, and I doubt I've done him an injury." The woman dropped her sewing. "Eh, dear," she cried, "is that lad o' mine in mischief again? I do hope he's no limb broken." "It inna that," said the old man, "but he's dazed like. Better lay him on th' squab." She calmly took Tommy and placed him gently down on the check-covered sofa under the window. "Come in, father, do." The man obeyed, astonished at the entire friendliness of this daughter, whom, though he had frequently seen her, he had never spoken to for more than 10 years. Her manner, at once filial and quite natural, perfectly ignored the long breach, and disclosed no trace of animosity. Father and daughter examined the unconscious child. Pale, pulseless, cold, he lay on the sofa like a corpse, except for the short, faint breaths which he drew through his blue lips. "I doubt I've killed him," said Eli. "Nay, nay, father." And her face actually smiled. This supremacy of the soul against years of continued misfortune lifted her high above him, and he suddenly felt himself an inferior creature. "I'll go for th' doctor," he said. "Nay, I shall need ye," and she put her head out of the window. "Mrs. Whalley, will ye let your Lucy run quick for the club doctor? My Tommy's hurt." The whole street awoke instantly from its nap, and in a few moments every door was occupied. Miriam closed her own door softly, as though she might wake the boy, and spoke in whispers to people through the window, finally telling them to go away. When the doctor came, half an hour afterwards, she had done all that she knew for Tommy, without the slightest apparent result. "What is it?" asked the doctor curtly, as he lifted the child's thin and lifeless hand. Eli Machin explained that he had boxed the boy's ear. "Tommy was impudent to his grandfather," Miriam added hastily. "Which ear?" the doctor inquired. "It was the left." He gazed into it, and then raised the boy's right leg and arm. "There's no paralysis," he said. Then he felt the heart, and then took out his stethoscope and applied it, listening intently. "Canst hear out?" the old man said. "I cannot," he answered. "Don't say that, doctor, don't say that," said Miriam, with an accent of appeal. "In these cases it is almost impossible to tell whether the patient is alive or dead. We must wait. Mrs. Baddeley, make a mustard plaster for his feet, and we will put another over the heart." And so they waited 1 hour while the clock ticked and the mustard plasters gradually cooled. Then Tommy's lips parted. After another half hour the doctor said, "I must go now. I'll come again at 6. Do nothing but apply fresh plasters. Be sure to keep his neck free. He is breathing, but I may as well be plain with you. There is a great risk of your child dying in this condition." Neighbours were again at the window, and Miriam drew the blind, waving them away. At 6 o'clock the doctor reappeared. "There is no change," he remarked. "I will call in before I go to bed." When he lifted the latch for the third time, at 10 o'clock, Eli Machin and Miriam still sat by the sofa, and Tommy still lay thereon, moveless, a terrible enigma. But the glass lamp was lighted on the mantelpiece, and Miriam's sewing, by which she earned a livelihood, had been hidden out of sight. "There is no change," said the doctor. "You can do nothing except hope." "And pray," the calm mother added. Eli neither stirred nor spoke. For 9 hours he had absolutely forgotten his engine. He knew the boy would die. The clock struck 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, each time fretting the nerves of the old man like a rasp. It was the hour of summer dawn. A cold grey light fell unkindly across the small figure on the sofa. "Open the door a bit, father," said Miriam. "The parlour's getting close. The lad canna breathe." "Nay, lass," Eli sighed as he stumbled obediently to the door. "The lad'll breathe no more. I've killed him in my anger." He frowned heavily, as though someone was annoying him. "Hist!" she exclaimed, when, after extinguishing the lamp, she returned to her boy's side. He's reddened! Look thee at his cheeks, father." She seized the child's inert hands and rubbed them between her own. The blood was now plain in Tommy's face. His legs faintly twitched. His breathing was slower. Miriam moved the coverlet and put her head upon his heart. "It's beating loud, father," she cried. "Bless God!" Eli stared at the child with the fixity of a statue. Then Tommy opened his eyes for an instant. The old man groaned. Tommy looked vacantly round, closed his eyes again, and was unmistakably asleep. He slept for 1 minute, then waked. Eli involuntarily put a hand on the sofa. Tommy gazed at him, and, with the most heavenly, innocent smile of recognition, lightly touched his grandfather's hand. Then he turned over on his right side. In the anguish of sudden joy, Eli gave a deep, piteous sob. That smile burnt into him like a coal fire. "Now for the beef tea," said Miriam, crying. "Beef tea?" the boy repeated after him, mildly questioning. "Yes, my poppet," she answered, and then aside, "Father, he can hear in his left ear. Did you notice it?" "It's a miracle of God," said Eli. In a few hours Tommy was as well as ever, indeed better. Not only was his hearing fully restored, but he had ceased to stammer, and the thin, almost imperceptible cloud upon his intellect was dissipated. The doctor expressed but little surprise at these phenomena, and, in fact, stated that similar things had occurred often before and were duly written down in the books of medicine. But Eli Machin's firm, instinctive faith that Providence had intervened will never be shaken. Miriam and Tommy now live in the villa cottage with the old people, End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Tales of the Five Towns. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Clifton. Tales of the Five Towns by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 8. The Idiot. William Froyle, ostler at the Queen's Arms at Moorthorne, took the letter, and, with a curt nod which stifled the loquacity of the village postman, went at once from the yard into the coach-house. He had recognised the handwriting on the envelope, and the recognition of it gave form and quick life to all the vague suspicions that had troubled him some months before, and again during the last few days. He felt suddenly the near approach of a frightful calamity which had long been stealing towards him. A wire-sheathed lantern set on a rough oaken table cast a wavering light round the coach-house and dimly showed the inner stable. Within the latter could just be distinguished the mottled grey flanks of a fat cob, which dragged its chain occasionally, making the large, slow movements of a horse comfortably lodged in its stall. The pleasant odour of animals and hay filled the wide spaces of the shed, and through the half-open door came a fresh, thin mist rising from the rain-soaked yard in the November evening. Froyle sat down on the oaken table, his legs dangling, and looked again at the envelope before opening it. He was a man about 30 years of age, with a serious and thoughtful, rather heavy countenance. He had a long, light moustache, and his skin was a fresh, rosy salmon colour. His straw-tinted hair was cut very short, except over the forehead, where it grew full and bushy. Dressed in his rough stable corduroys, his forearms bare and white, he had all the appearance of the sturdy Englishman, the sort of Englishman that crosses the world in order to find vent for his taciturn energy on virgin soils. From the whole village he commanded and received respect. He was known for a scholar, and it was his scholarship which had obtained for him the proud position of secretary to the Provident Society styled the Queen's Arms Slate Club. His respectability and his learning combined had enabled him to win with dignity the hand of Susie Trimmer, the grocer's daughter, to whom he had been engaged about a year. The village could not make up its mind concerning that match. Without doubt it was a social victory for Froyle, but everyone wondered that so sedate and sagacious a man should have seen in Susie a suitable mate. He tore open the envelope with his huge forefinger, and, bending down towards the lantern, began to read the letter. It ran: Oldcastle Street, Bursley. Dear Will, I asked father to tell you, but he would not. He said I must write. Dear Will, I hope you will never see me again. As you will see by the above address, I am now at Aunt Penrose's at Bursley. She is awful angry, but I was obliged to leave the village because of my shame. I have been a wicked girl. It was in July. You know the man because you asked me about him one Sunday night. He is no good, he's a villain. Please forget all about me. I want to go to London. So many people know me here, and what with people coming in from the village too. Please forgive me. S. Trimmer. After reading the letter a second time, Froyle folded it up and put it in his pocket. Beyond a slight, unaccustomed pallor of the red cheeks, he showed no sign of emotion. Before the arrival of the postman, he had been cleaning his master's bicycle, which stood against the table. To this he returned. Kneeling down in some fresh straw, he used his dusters slowly and patiently, rubbing, then stopping to examine the result, and then rubbing again. When the machine was polished to his satisfaction, he wheeled it carefully into the stable, where it occupied a stall next to that of the cob. As he passed back again, the animal leisurely turned its head and gazed at Froyle with its large liquid eyes. He slapped the immense flank. Content, the animal returned to its feed, and the weighted chain ran down with a rattle. The fortnightly meeting of the Slate Club was to take place at 8 o'clock that evening. Froyle had employed part of the afternoon in making ready his books for the event, to him always so solemn and ceremonious, and the affairs of the club were now prominent in his mind. He was sorry that it would be impossible for him to attend the meeting. Fortunately, all the usual preliminaries were complete. He took a piece of notepaper from a little hanging cupboard and, sprawling across the table, began to write under the lantern. The pencil seemed a tiny toy in his thick, roughened fingers. To Mr. Andrew McCall, Chairman, Queen's Arms Slate Club. Dear Sir, I regret to inform you that I shall not be at the meeting tonight. You will find the books in order. Here he stopped, biting the end of the pencil in thought. He put down the pencil and stepped hastily out of the stable, across the yard and into the hotel. In the large room, the room where cyclists sometimes took tea and cold meat during the summer season, the long deal table and the double line of oaken chairs stood ready for the meeting. A fire burnt warmly in the big grate, and the hanging lamp had been lighted. On the wall was a large card containing the rules of the club, which had been written out in a fair hand by the schoolmaster. It was to this card that Froyle went. Passing his thumb down the card, he paused at Rule 7. Each member shall, on the death of another member, pay 1 shilling for benefit of widow or nominee of deceased, same to be paid within 1 month after notice given. Or nominee, he murmured reflectively, staring at the card. He mechanically noticed, what he had noticed often before with disdain, that the chairman had signed the rules without the use of capitals. He went back to the dusk of the coach-house to finish his letter, still murmuring the word nominee, of whose meaning he was not quite sure. I request that the money due to me from the Slate Club on my death shall be paid to my nominee, Miss Susan Trimmer, now staying with her aunt, Mrs. Penrose, at Bursley. Yours respectfully, William Froyle. After further consideration, he added, P.S. My annual salary of 6pence per member would be due at the end of December. If so be the members would pay that, or part of it, should they consider the same due, to Susan Trimmer as well, I should be thankful. Yours resp. W.F. He put the letter in an envelope and, taking it to the large room, laid it carefully at the end of the table opposite the chairman's seat. Once more he returned to the coach-house. From the hanging cupboard he now produced a piece of rope. Standing on the table he could just reach, by leaning forward, a hook in the ceiling that was sometimes used for the slinging of bicycles. With difficulty he made the rope fast to the hook. Putting a noose on the other end, he tightened it round his neck. He looked up at the ceiling and down at the floor in order to judge whether the rope was short enough. "Goodbye, Susan and everyone," he whispered, and then stepped off the table. The tense rope swung him by his neck halfway across the coach-house. He swung twice to and fro, but as he passed under the hook for the 5th time, his toes touched the floor. The rope had stretched. In another second he was standing firm on the floor, purple and panting, but ignominiously alive. "Good evening to you, Mr. Froyle. Be you committing suicide?" The tones were drawling, uncertain, mildly astonished. He turned round hastily, his hands busy with the rope, and saw in the doorway the figure of Daft Jimmy, the Moorthorne idiot. He hesitated before speaking, but he was not confused. No one could have been confused before Daft Jimmy. Neither man nor woman in the village considered his presence more than that of a cat. "Yes, I am," he said. The middle-aged idiot regarded him with a vague, interested smile, and came into the coach-house. "You'n gotten the rope too long, Mr. Froyle. Let me help you." Froyle calmly assented. He stood on the table, and the two rearranged the noose and made it secure. As they did so, the idiot gossiped, "I was going to Bursley tonight to buy me a pair of boots, and when I was at top of the hill, I remembered as I'd forgotten the measure of my feet. So I ran back again for it. Then I saw the light in here, and I stepped up to bid ye good evening." Someone had told him the ancient story of the fool and his boots, and with the pride of an idiot in his idiocy, He had determined that it should be related of himself. Froyle was silent. The idiot laughed with a dry cackle. 'Now you go,' said Froyle when the rope was fixed. 'Let me see you do it,' the idiot pleaded with pathetic eyes. 'No, out you get.' Protesting, the idiot went forth, and his irregular, clumsy footsteps sounded on the pebble-paved yard. When the noise of them ceased in the soft roadway, Froyle jumped off the table again. Gradually his body, like a stopping pendulum, came to rest under the hook, and hung twitching with strange, disconnected movements. The horse in the stable, hearing unaccustomed noises, rattled his chain and stamped about in the straw of his box. Furtive steps came down the yard again, and Daft Jimmy peeped into the coach-house. 'He done it! He done it!' the idiot cried gleefully. 'Damned if he hasna!' He slapped his leg and almost danced. The body still twitched occasionally. 'He done it!' 'Done what, Daft Jimmy? You're making a fine noise there. Done what?' The idiot ran out of the stable. At the side entrance to the hotel stood the barmaid, the outline of her fine figure distinct against the light from within. The idiot continued to laugh. 'Done what?' the girl repeated, calling out across the dark yard in clear, pleasant tones of amused inquiry. 'Done what?' 'What's that to you, Miss Tucker?' 'Now, none of your sauce, Daft Jimmy. Is Willie Froyle in there?' The idiot roared with laughter. 'Yes, he is, miss.' 'Well, tell him his master wants him. I don't want to cross this mucky, messy yard.' 'Yes, miss.' The girl closed the door. The idiot went into the coach-house, and, slapping William's body in a friendly way, so that it trembled on the rope, he spluttered out between his laughs, 'Master wants ye, Mr. Froyle.' Then he walked out into the village street, and stood looking up the muddy road, still laughing quietly. It was quite dark, but the moon aloft in the clear sky showed the highway with its shining ruts leading in a straight line over the hill to Bursley. 'Them shoes!' the idiot ejaculated suddenly. 'Well, I be an idiot, and that's true. They can take the measure from my feet, and I never thought on it till this minute.' Laughing again, he set off at a run up the hill. End of chapter 8. Two of Tales of the Five Towns, Abroad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Clifton. Tales of the Five Towns by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 9. The Hungarian Rhapsody. Part 1. After a honeymoon of 5 weeks in the shining cities of the Mediterranean and in Paris, they re-entered the British Empire by the august portals of the Chatham and Dover Railway. They stood impatiently waiting part of a well-dressed, querulous crowd, while a few officials performed their daily task of improvising a custom house for registered luggage on a narrow platform of Victoria Station. John, Mr. Norris's man, who had met them, attended behind. Suddenly, with a characteristic movement, the husband lifted his head and then looked down at his wife. 'I say, May.' 'Well?' She knew that he was about to propose some swift alteration of their plans, but she smiled upwards out of her furs at his grave face, and the tone of her voice granted all requests in advance. 'I think I'd better go to the office,' he said. 'Now?' She smiled again, inviting him to do exactly what he chose. She was already familiar with his restiveness under enforced delays and inaction, and his unfortunate capacity for being actively bored by trifles which did not interest him aroused in her a sort of maternal sympathy. 'Yes,' he answered, 'I can be there and back in an hour or less. You titivate yourself, and we'll dine at the Savoy, or anywhere you please. We'll keep the ball rolling tonight.' 'Yes,' he repeated, as if to convince himself that he was not a deserter. 'I really must call in at the office. You and John can see to the luggage, can't you?' 'Of course,' she replied with calm good nature, and also with perfect self-confidence. 'But give me the keys of the trunks, and don't be late, Ted.' 'Oh, I shan't be late,' he said. Their fingers touched as she took the keys. He went away enraptured anew by her delightful acquiescences, her unique smile, her common sense, her mature charm, and the astonishing elegance of her person. The honeymoon was over, and with what finished discretion, combining the innocent girl with the woman of the world, she had lived through the honeymoon. Another life, more delicious, was commencing. What a wife, he thought triumphantly. She does understand a man. And fancy leaving an ordinary bride to look after luggage. Nevertheless, once in his offices at Winchester House, he managed to forget her and to forget time for nearly an hour and a half. When at last he came to himself from the enchantment of affairs, he jumped into a hansom and told the driver to drive fast to Knightsbridge. He was ardent to see her again. In the dark seclusion of the cab he speculated upon her toilette, the colour of her shoes. He thought of the last 5 weeks, of the next 5 years. Dwelling on their mutual love and esteem, their health, their self-knowledge and experience and cheerfulness, her sense and grace, his talent for getting money first and keeping it afterwards. He foresaw nothing but happiness for them. Children? Possibly. At Piccadilly Circus it began to rain, cold, heavy March rain. 'Window down, sir?' asked the voice of the cabman. 'Yes,' he ordered sardonically. 'Better be suffocated than drowned.' 'You're right, sir,' said the voice. Soon, through the streaming glass, which made every gas jet into a shooting pillar of flame, Norris discerned vaguely the vast bulk of Hyde Park Mansions. 'Good,' he muttered. And at that very moment he was shot through the window into the thin, light-reflecting mire of the street. Enormous and strange beasts menaced him with pitiless hoofs. Millions of people crowded about him. In response to a question that seemed to float slowly towards him, he tried to give his address. He realized by a considerable feat of intellect that the horse must have fallen down. And then, with a dim notion that nothing mattered, he went to sleep. Part 2. In the boudoir of the magnificent flat on the first floor, shielded from the noise and the inclemency of the world by 4 silk-hung walls and a double window, and surrounded by all the multitudinous and costly luxury that a stockbroker with brains and taste can obtain for the wife of his love, May was leisurely finishing her toilette. And every detail in the long, elaborate process was accomplished with a passionate intention to bewitch the man at Winchester House. These two had first met 7 years before, when May, the daughter of a successful wholesale draper at Hanbridge in the Five Towns district of Staffordshire, was aged 22. Mr. Scarratt went to Manchester each Tuesday to buy, and about once a month he took May with him. One day, when they were lunching at the Exchange restaurant, a young man came up whom her father introduced as Mr. Edward Norris, his stockbroker. Mr. Norris, whose years were 30, glanced keenly at May and accepted Mr. Scarratt's invitation to join them. Ever afterwards, May vividly remembered the wonderful sensation, joyous yet disconcerting, which she then experienced. The sensation of having captivated her father's handsome and correct stockbroker. The three talked horses with a certain freedom, and since May was accustomed to drive the Scarratt dog-cart, so famous in the Five Towns, she could bring her due share to the conversation. The meal over, Mr. Norris discussed business matters with his client, and then sedately departed, but not without the obviously sincere expression of a desire to meet Miss Scarratt again. The wholesale draper praised Edward's financial qualities behind his back, and wondered that a man of such aptitude should remain in Manchester while London existed. As for May, she decided that she would have a new frock before she came to Manchester in the following month. She had a new frock, but not of the colour intended. By the following month her father was enclosed in a coffin, and it happened to his estate, as to the estates of many successful men who employ stockbrokers, that the liabilities far more than covered the assets. May and her mother were left without a penny. The mother did the right thing and died. It was best. May went direct to Brunt's, the largest draper in the Five Towns, and asked for a place under Madame in the dressmaking department. Brunt's daughter, who was about to be married, gave her the place instantly. 3 years later, when Madame returned to Paris, May stepped into the Frenchwoman's shoes. On Sundays and on Thursday afternoons, and sometimes, but not too often, at the theatre, May was the finest walking advertisement that Brunt's ever had. Old Brunt would have proposed to her, it was rumoured, had he not been scared by her elegance. Sundry sons of prosperous manufacturers, unabashed by this elegance, did in fact secretly propose, but with what result was known only to themselves. Later, as May waxed in importance at Brunt's, she was sent to Manchester to buy. She lunched at the Exchange Restaurant. The world and Manchester are very small. The first man she set eyes on was Edward Norris. Another week, Norris said to her with a thrill, and he would have been gone for ever to London. Chance is not to be flouted. The sequel was inevitable. They loved, and all the select private bars in Hanbridge tinkled to the news that May Scarratt had been and hooked a stockbroker. When the toilette was done and the maid gone, she wound a thin black scarf round her olive neck and shoulders, and sat down negligently on a Chippendale settee in the attitude of a portrait by Boldini. Her little feet were tucked up sideways on the settee. The perforated lace ends of the scarf fell over her low corsage to the level of the seat. And she waited, still the bride. He was late, but she knew he would be late. Sure in the conviction that he was a strong man, a man of imagination and of deeds, she could easily excuse this failing in him, as she did that other habit of impulsive action in trifles. Nay, more, she found keen pleasure in excusing it. Dear thing, she reflected, he forgets so. Therefore she waited, content in enjoying the image in the glass of her dark face, her small, plump person and her Paris gown, that dream. She thought with assuaged grief of her father's tragedy. She would have liked him to see her now, the jewel in the case. Her father and she had understood each other. All around and above and below she felt, without hearing it, the activity of the opulent, complex life of the mansions. Her mind dwelt with satisfaction on long, carpeted corridors noiselessly paraded by flunkies, mahogany lifts continually ascending and descending like the angels of the ladder, the great entrance hall with its fire always burning and its doors always swinging, the salle à manger sown with rose-shaded candles, and all the splendid privacies rising stage upon stage to the attics, where the flunkies philosophized together. She confessed the beauty and distinction achieved by this extravagant organization for gratifying earthly desires. Often in the pinching days of her servitude she had murmured against the injustice of things, and had called wealth a crime while poverty starved. But now she perceived that society was what it was inevitably and could not be altered. She accepted it in profound peace of mind, gaily fraternal towards the fortunate, compassionate towards those in adversity. In the next flat someone began to play very brilliantly a Hungarian rhapsody of Liszt's, and even the faint sound of that riotous torrent of melody, so arrogantly gorgeous, intoxicated her soul. She shivered under the sudden vision of the splendid joy of being alive. And how she envied the player! French she had learnt from Madame, but she had no skill on the piano. It was her one regret. She touched the bell. 'Has your master come in yet?' she inquired of the maid. 'No, madame, not yet.' She knew he had not come in, but she could not resist the impulse to ask. 10 minutes later, when the piano had ceased, she jumped up and, creeping to the front door of the flat, gazed foolishly across the corridor at the grille of the lift. She heard the lift in travail. It appeared and passed out of sight above. No, he had not come. Glancing aside, she saw the tall, slender figure of a girl in a green tea-gown. A mere girl. It was the player of the Hungarian Rhapsody. And this girl, too, she thought, was expectant and disappointed. They shut their doors simultaneously, she and May, who also had her girlish moments. Then the rhapsody recommenced. 'Oh, madame!' screamed the maid, almost tumbling into the boudoir. 'What is it?' May demanded with false calm. The maid lifted the corner of her black apron to her eyes, as though she had been a stage soubrette in trouble. 'The master, madame, he's fell out of his cab, just in front of the mansions, and they're bringing him in. Such blood I never did see.' The maid finished with hysterics. Part 3. And them just off their honeymoon. The inconsolable tones of the lady's maid came from the kitchen to the open door of the bedroom, where May was giving instructions to the elderly cook. 'Send that girl out of the flat this moment,' May said. 'Yes, ma'am.' 'Make the beef tea in case it's wanted, and let me have some more warm water. There's John and the doctor.' She started at a knock. 'No, it's only the postman, ma'am.' Some letters danced on the hall floor and on her nerves. 'Oh dear,' May whispered. 'I thought it was the doctor at last.' 'John's bound to be back with one in a minute, ma'am. Do bear up,' urged the cook, hurrying to the kitchen. She could have destroyed the woman for those last words. With the proud certainty of being equal to the dreadful crisis, she turned abruptly into the bedroom, where her husband lay insensible on one of the new beds. Assisted by the policeman and the cook, she had done everything that could be done: cut away the coats and the waistcoat, removed the boots, straightened the limbs, washed the face and neck, especially the neck, which had to be sponged continually, and scattered messengers, including John, over the vicinity in search of medical aid. And now the policeman had gone, the general emotion on the staircase had subsided, the front door of the flat was shut. The great ocean of life of the mansions had closed smoothly upon her little episode. She was alone with the shattered organism. She bent fondly over the bed, and her Paris frock and the black scarf which she had not removed touched its ruinous burden. Her right hand directed the sponge with ineffable tenderness, and then the long thin fingers tightened to a frenzied clutch to squeeze it over the basin. The whole of her being was absorbed in a deep passion of pity and an intolerable hunger for the doctor. Through the wall came once more the faint sound of the Hungarian Rhapsody, astonishingly rapid and brilliant. She set her teeth to endure its unconscious message of the vast indifference of life to death. The organism stirred, and May watched the deathly face for a sign. The eyes opened and stared at her in agonized bewilderment. The lips tried to speak and failed. 'It's all right, darling,' she said softly. 'You're in your own bed. The doctor will be here directly. Drink this.' She gave him some brandy and water, and they looked at each other. He was no longer Edward Norris, the finely regulated intelligence, the masterful volition, the conqueror of the world and of a woman, but merely the embodiment of a frightened, despairing, flickering, hysterical will to live, which glanced in terror at the corners of the room as though it saw fate there. And beneath her intense solicitude was the instinctive feeling, which hurt her but which she could not dismiss, of her measureless, dominating superiority. With what glad relief would she have changed places with him! 'I'm dying, May,' he murmured at length with a sigh. 'Why doesn't the doctor come?' 'He is coming,' she replied soothingly. 'You'll be better soon.' But his effort in speaking obliged her to use the sponge again, and he saw it and drew another sigh, more mortal than the first. 'Oh, I'm dying,' he repeated. 'Not you, Ted.' And her smile cost her an awful pang. 'I am. I know it.' This time he spoke with sad resignation. 'You must face it. And listen.' 'What, dear?' A physical sensation of sickness came over her. She could not disguise from herself the fact that he was dying. The warped and pallid face, the panic-struck eyes, the sweat, the wound in the neck, the damp hands nervously pulling at the hem of the sheet, these indications were not to be gainsaid. The truth was too horrible to grasp. She wanted to put it away from her. 'This calamity cannot happen to me,' she thought urgently, and all the while she knew that it was happening to her. He collected the feeble remnant of his powers by an immense effort, and began to speak, slowly and fragmentarily. and with such weakness that she could only catch his words by putting her ear to his mouth. The restless hands dropped the sheet and took the end of the black scarf. 'You'll be comfortable for money,' he said. 'Will made, it's not that. I must tell you, it's.' 'Yes,' she encouraged him. 'Tell me, I can hear.' 'It's about your father. I didn't treat him quite right once. Week after I first met you, May. No, not quite right. He was holding Hull and Barnsley shares. You know, railway, great gambling stock then. Hull and Barnsley. Holding them on cover for the rise. They dropped too much. Dropped to 23. He couldn't hold any longer. Wired to me to sell and cut the loss. Understand?' 'Yes,' she said, trembling. 'I quite understand.' 'Well, I wired back, sold at 23, but some mistake. Shares not sold. Clerk's mistake. Clerk didn't sell. Next day, rise began. I didn't wire him shares not sold. Somehow I couldn't. Put it off. Rise went on. I took over shares myself. You see, myself. Made nearly 5,000 clear. I wanted money then. I think I would have told him, perhaps, later. Made it right. But he died. Sudden. I wasn't going to let his creditors have that 5,000. No, he'd meant to sell. And look here, May, if those shares had dropped lower instead of rising, I should have had to stand the racket. With your father for my clerk's mistake. See? He'd meant to sell. Hard lines on him, but he'd meant to sell. He'd meant... Don't say any more, dear. Must explain this, May. Why didn't I give the money to you when he was dead? Because I knew you'd only give it to creditors. I knew you. That's straight. I've told you now. He lost consciousness again, but for an instant May did not notice it. She was crying, and her tears fell on his face. Then came a doctor, a little dark man, who explained with calm politeness that he had been out when the messenger first arrived. He took off his coat, hung it up, opened his bag, and proceeded to a minute examination of the patient. His movements were so methodical, and he gave orders to May in a tone so quiet, casual, and ordinary, that she almost lost her sense of the reality of the scene. 'Yes, yes,' he said from time to time, as if to himself. Nothing else, not a single enlightening word to May. 'I'm dying,' moaned Edward, opening his eyes. The doctor glanced round at May and winked. That wink, deliberate and humorous, was like an electric shock to her. She could actually feel her heart leap in her breast. If she had not been afraid of the doctor, she would have fainted. 'You all think you're dying,' the doctor remarked in a low, amused tone to the ceiling as he wiped a pair of scissors, 'when you've been knocked silly, especially if there's a lot of blood about.' The door opened. 'Here's John, ma'am,' said the cook, 'with 2 more doctors. What am I to do?' May involuntarily turned towards the door. 'Don't you go, Mrs. Norris,' the little dark man commanded. 'I want you.' Then he carelessly scrutinized the elderly servant. 'Tell 'em they're too late,' he said. 'It's generally like that when there's an accident,' he continued after the housekeeper had gone. 'First you can't get a doctor anywhere, and then in half an hour or so we come in crowds. I've known 7 doctors turn up one after another, but in that affair the man happened to have been killed outright.' He smiled grimly. In a little while he was snapping his bag. 'I'll come in the morning, of course,' he said, as he wrote on a piece of paper. 'Have this made up and give it him in the night if he is wakeful. Keep him warm. You might put a couple of hot water bags, one on either side of him. You've got beef tea made, you say? That's right. Let him have as much as he wants. Mr. Norris, you'll sleep like a top.' 'But, doctor,' May inquired the next morning in the hall, after Edward had smiled at a joke and been informed that he must run down to Bournemouth in a week, 'have we nothing to fear?' 'I think not,' was the measured answer. 'These affairs nearly always seem much worse than they are. Of course, the immediate upset is tremendous, the disorganisation and all that sort of thing. But nature's pretty wonderful. You'll find your husband will soon get over it. I should say he had a good constitution.' 'And there will be no permanent effects?' 'Yes,' said the doctor with genial cynicism. 'There'll be one permanent effect. Nobody will ever persuade him to ride in a hansom again. If he can't find a four-wheeler, he'll walk in future. She returned to the bedroom. The man on the bed was Edward Norris once more, in control of himself, risen out of his humiliation. A feeling of thankfulness overwhelmed her for a moment, and she sat down. 'Well, May,' he murmured. 'Well, dear.' They both realized that what they had been through was a common daily street accident. The smile of each was self-conscious, apprehensive, insincere. 'Quite a concert going on next door,' he said, with an affectation of lightness. It was the Hungarian Rhapsody, impetuous and brilliant as ever. How she hated it now, this symbol of the hurried, unheeding, relentless, hollow gaiety of the world. Yet she longed for the magic fingers of the player, that she, too, might smother grief in such glittering veils. Part 4. The marriage, which had begun so dramatically, fell into placid routine. Edward fulfilled the prophecy of the doctor. In a week they were able to go to Bournemouth for a few days, and in less than a fortnight he was at the office, the strong man again, confident and ambitious. After days devoted to finance, he came home in the evenings, high-spirited and determined to enjoy himself. His voice was firm and his eyes steady when he spoke to his wife. There was no trace of self-consciousness in his demeanour. She admired the masculinity of the brain that could forget by an effort of will. She felt that he trusted her to forget also, that he relied on her common sense, her characteristic sagacity, to extinguish forever the memory of an awkward incident. He loved her. He was intensely proud of her. He treated her with every sort of generosity. And in return he expected her to behave like a man. She loved him. She esteemed him as a wife should. She made a profession of wifehood. He gave his days to finance and his nights to diversion. But her vocation was always with her. She was never off duty. She aimed to please him to the uttermost in everything, to be in all respects the ideal helpmate of a husband who was at once strenuous, fastidious, and wealthy. Elegance and suavity were a religion with her. She was the delight of the eye and of the ear, the soother of groans, the refuge of distress, the uplifter of the heart. She made new acquaintances for him and cemented old friendships. Her manner towards his old friends enchanted him, but when they were gone she had a way of making him feel that she was only his. She thought that she was succeeding in her aim. She thought that all these sweet, endless labours of traffic with dressmakers, milliners, coiffeurs, maids, cooks and furnishers, of paying and receiving calls, of delicious surprise journeys to the city to bring home the breadwinner, of giving and accepting dinners, of sitting alert and appreciative in theatres and music halls, of supping in golden restaurants, of being serious, cautionary, submissive and subductive, of smiles, laughter and kisses, and of continuous sympathetic responsiveness, she thought that all these labours had attained their object, Edward's complete serenity and satisfaction. She imagined that love and duty had combined successfully to deceive him on one solitary point. She was sure that he was deceived, but she was wrong. One evening they were at the theatre alone together. It was a musical comedy, and they had a large stage box. May sat a little behind. After having been darkened for a scenic conjuring trick, the stage was very suddenly thrown into brilliant light. Edward turned with equal suddenness to share his appreciation of the effect with his wife, and the light and his eye caught her unawares. She smiled instantly, but too late. He had seen the expression of her features. For a second she felt as if the whole fabric which she had been building for the last 6 months had crumbled, but this disturbing idea passed as she recovered herself. 'Let's go home, eh?' he said, at the end of the first act. 'Yes,' she agreed. 'It would be nice to be in early, wouldn't it?' In the brougham they exchanged the amiable banalities of people who are thoroughly intimate. When they reached the flat, she poured out his whisky and potass, and sat on the arm of his particular armchair while he sipped it. Then she whispered that she was going to bed. "Wait a bit," he said. "I want to talk to you seriously." "Dear thing," she murmured, stroking his coat. She had not the slightest notion of his purpose. "You've tried your best, May," he said bluntly, "but you've failed. I've suspected it for a long time." She flushed and retired to a sofa away from the orange electric lamp. "What do you mean, Edward?" she asked. "You know very well what I mean, my dear," he replied. "What I told you that night. You've tried to forget it. You've tried to look at me as though you had forgotten it. But you can't do it. It's on your mind. I've noticed it again and again. I noticed it at the theatre tonight. So I said to myself, I'll have it out with her, and I'm having it out." "My dear Ted, I assure you—" "No, you don't," he stopped her. "I wish you did. Now, you must just listen. I know exactly what sort of an idiot I was that night, as well as you do. But I couldn't help it. I was a fool to tell you. Still, I thought I was dying. I simply had a babbling fit. People are like that. You thought I was dying too, didn't you?" "Yes," she said quietly, "for a minute or two." "Ah, it was that minute or two that did it. Well, I let it out, the rotten little secret. I admit it wasn't on the square, that bit of business. But on the other hand, it wasn't anything really bad, like cruelty to animals or ruining a girl. Of course, the chap was your father, but look here, May, you ought to be able to see that I was exactly the same man after I told you as I was before. You ought to be able to see that. My character wasn't wrecked because I happened to split on myself like an ass about the affair. Mind you, I don't blame you. You can't help your feelings. But do you suppose there's a single man on this blessed earth without a secret? I'm not going to grovel before gods or men. I'm not going to pretend I'm so frightfully sorry. I'm sorry in a way, but can't you see—" "Don't say any more, Ted," she begged him, fingering her sash. "I know all that. I know it all, and everything else you can say. Oh, my darling boy, do you think I would look down on you ever so little because of what you told me? Who am I? I wouldn't care twopence even if—" "But it's between us all the same," he broke in. "You can't get over it." "Get over it," she repeated lamely. "Can you? Have you?" He pinned her to a direct answer. She did not flinch. "No," she said. "I thought you would have done," he remarked, half to himself. "I thought you would. I thought you were enough a woman of the world for that, May. It isn't as if the confounded thing had made any real difference to your father. The old man died, and—" "Ted," she exclaimed, "I shall have to tell you after all. It's killed him." "What killed him? He died of gastritis." "He was ill with gastritis, but he died of suicide. It's easy for a gastritis patient to commit suicide, and father did." "Why?" "Oh, ruin, despair. He'd been in difficulties for a long time. He said that selling those shares just one day too soon was the end of it. When he saw them going up day after day, it got on his mind. He said he knew he would never, never have any luck. And then—" "You kept it quiet?" He was walking about the room. "Yes, that was pretty easy." "And did your mother know?" He turned and looked at her. "Yes, mother knew. It finished her." "Oh, Ted," she burst out, "if you'd only telegraphed to him the next morning that the shares weren't sold, things might have been quite different." "You mean I killed your father and your mother?" "No, I don't," she cried passionately. "I tell you I don't. You didn't know. But I think of it all sometimes. And that's why—" She sat down again. "By God, May," he swore, "I'm frightfully sorry." "I never meant to tell you," she said, composing herself. "But there, things slip out. Good night." She was gone, but in passing him she had timidly caressed his shoulder. "It's all up," he said to himself. "This will always be between us. No one could expect her to forget it." Part 5. Gradually her characteristic habits deserted her. She seemed to lose energy and a part of her interest in those things which had occupied her most. She changed her dress less frequently, ignoring dressmakers, and she showed no longer the ravishing elegance of the bride. She often lay in bed till noon, she who had always entered the dining room at 9 o'clock precisely to dispense his coffee and listen to his remarks on the contents of the newspaper. She said, "As you please," to the cook, and the meals began to lose their piquancy. She paid no calls, but some of her women friends continued nevertheless to visit her. Lastly, she took to sewing. The little dark doctor, who had become an acquaintance, smiled at her and told her to do no more than she felt disposed to do. She reclined on sofas in shaded rooms and appeared to meditate. She was not depressed, but thoughtful. It was as though she had much to settle in her own mind. At intervals, the faint sound of the Hungarian Rhapsody mingled with her reveries. As for Edward, his behaviour was immaculate. During the day he made money furiously. In the evening he sat with his wife. They did not talk much, and he never questioned her. She developed a certain curious whimsicality now and then, but for him she could do no wrong. The past was not mentioned. They both looked apprehensively towards the future, towards a crisis which they knew was inexorably approaching. They were afraid while pretending to have no fear. And one afternoon, precipitately, surprisingly, the crisis came. 'You are the father of a son, a very noisy son,' said the doctor, coming into the drawing-room, where Edward had sat in torture for 3 hours. 'And May? Oh, never fear, she's doing excellently.' 'Can I go and see her?' he asked, like a humble petitioner. 'Well, yes,' said the doctor, 'for 1 minute, not more.' So he went into the bedroom as into a church, feeling a fool. The nurse, miraculously white and starched, stood like a sentinel at the foot of the bed of mystery. 'All serene, May?' he questioned. If he had attempted to say another word, he would have cried. The pale mother nodded with a fatigued smile, and by a scarcely perceptible gesture drew his attention to a bundle. From the next flat came a faint, familiar sound, insolently joyous. Yes, he thought, but if they'd both been lying dead here, that tune would have been the same. 2 months later, he left the office early, telling his secretary that he had a headache. It was a mere fibbing excuse. He suffered from sudden fits of anxiety about his wife and child. When he reached the flat, he found no one at home but the cook. 'Where's your mistress?' he demanded. 'She's out in the park with baby and nurse, sir.' 'But it's going to rain,' he cried angrily. 'It is raining. They'll get wet through.' He rushed into the corridor and met the procession: May, the perambulator, and the nursemaid. 'Only fancy, Ted,' May exclaimed. 'The perambulator will go into the lift after all. Aren't you glad?' 'Yes,' he said, 'but you're wet, surely.' 'Not a drop. We just got in time.' 'Sure?' 'Quite.' The tableau of May, elegant as ever, but her eyes brighter and her body more leniently curved, of the hooded perambulator, and of the fluffy white nursemaid behind, it was too much for him. Touching clumsily the apron of the perambulator, the stockbroker turned into his doorway. Just then the girl from the next flat came out into the corridor, dressed for social rites of the afternoon. The perambulator was her excuse for stopping. 'What a pretty boy!' she exclaimed in ecstasy, trying to squeeze her picture hat under the hood of the perambulator. 'Do you really think so?' said the mother, enchanted. 'Oh, of course, the darling! How I envy you!' May wanted to reciprocate this politeness. 'I can't tell you,' she said, 'how I envy you your piano playing. There's one piece.' 'Envy me? Why, it's only a pianola we've got.' 'Isn't he the picture of his granddad?' said May to Edward, when they bent over the cot that night before retiring. And as she said it, there was such candour in her voice, such content in her smiling and courageous eyes, that Edward could not fail to comprehend her message to him. Down in some very secret part of his soul he felt for the first time the real force of the great explanatory truth that one generation succeeds another. End of chapter 9.